The hinges screamed as the cutting torch bit through 70 years of rust. Inside the bunker, 7 chairs faced a silent radio, each one occupied. What happened in that Louisiana swamp between 1953 and the day the doors were sealed from the inside matters, because it suggests some experiments should never be repeated. October 9th, 2023. The contractor's name was Miguel Reyes, and he'd spent 3 weeks clearing vines from what the Corps of Engineers map called Structure 47B. The air tasted like copper and rotting magnolia. Mosquitoes rose in clouds each time his crew disturbed the black water pooling around the concrete threshold. The bunker squatted in Plaquemines Parish, 40 miles south of New Orleans, where the Mississippi Delta fractures into channels that don't appear on civilian charts. Reyes had been hired to assess structural integrity before the land was sold to a natural gas surveyor. Nobody mentioned what the building had been used for. Nobody needed to. The door was the wrong kind of sealed. Standard military procedure bolted bunkers from outside. Pad eyes welded to the exterior frame. Chains threaded through. Locks that could be cut by engineers in an emergency. Structure 47B showed something else entirely. 8 neat beads of weld ran along the interior seam, visible only after Reyes's torch peeled back the outer plate. Someone had trapped themselves inside on purpose. "Call it in," his foreman said, stepping back from the threshold. The sheriff's office arrived first, then the state archaeologist. By dusk, 3 black SUVs idled in the clearing, and men in khaki fatigues erected a perimeter fence without explaining why. Reyes watched them unload ground-penetrating radar, biohazard suits, a refrigerated trailer. One of them, a woman with lieutenant's bars and a face that had practiced saying nothing, asked if he'd touched anything inside. He hadn't. The smell alone had kept him at the door. The Army took 6 days to extract what the bunker held. They worked under Klieg lights that turned the swamp into a stage, and they refused to let Reyes's crew within 200 yards. But sound carries across still water, and on the 3rd night, Reyes heard someone vomit into the underbrush. On the 5th, a younger officer sat on the tailgate of a truck, hands shaking, talking into a satellite phone about configuration and no signs of struggle. By the time the refrigerated trailer left, escorted by state police, the only thing Reyes knew for certain was what he'd glimpsed in those first 10 seconds before the foreman pulled him back. 7 skeletons, 7 chairs, all facing the same direction. And beneath the center console, scratched into the concrete in letters 8 inches tall, we heard it answer. The story begins 70 years earlier, when the United States Army needed a place no one would look for. March 1953. Korea was grinding into stalemate. Stalin had just died, and the Pentagon was building things it didn't put in budgets. Camp Catahoula wasn't on any map. Officially, it didn't exist. Even the soldiers stationed there received mail through a post office box in Baton Rouge, their letters stamped with a generic APO code that could have meant Alaska or Alabama. The camp sprawled across 12 square miles of swamp that flooded every spring and bred water moccasins thick as a man's wrist. The mosquitoes carried malaria until the Army dumped enough DDT to turn the creek white. What they built there was called the Signal Intercept Research Facility. The name meant nothing, which was the point. 1953 was the year the Cold War turned electronic. Soviet submarines had started transmitting on frequencies nobody understood. Chinese broadcasts contained patterns that didn't match any known cipher. And deep in the Appalachian hollows, ham radio operators reported hearing voices that spoke in no language at all. voices that came through even when they unplugged their sets. The Army wanted answers, quietly. So they sent Captain Marcus Drummond and 6 specialists to a bunker in the Louisiana mud and told them to listen. Before we go further, drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Hit that like button if you're already hooked. And subscribe, because this story goes places the official records won't admit. Now here's what makes Captain Drummond's assignment strange even by Cold War standards. The men selected for his unit weren't linguists or engineers. Private Theodore Lyle had been a seminary student. Corporal Raymond Webb listed his civilian occupation as dowser. Staff Sergeant Aaron Polk had spent 2 years in a veterans hospital after reporting that he could taste metal whenever someone lied to him. The files don't explain the selection criteria, but they suggest the Army was looking for something other than technical skill. They were looking for receivers. The equipment they installed in Structure 47B wasn't standard Signal Corps' issue. Requisition orders show 3 Hallicrafters SX-43 shortwave receivers, a custom-built frequency synthesizer that pulled 50 amps, and something listed only as Resonance Array Experimental. The array drew enough power that the camp generator had to be upgraded twice. When it ran at full strength, lights dimmed in the Quonset huts a quarter-mile away. On May 12, 1953, Drummond's team sealed themselves inside the bunker for what the duty log called extended monitoring operations. They were supposed to emerge after 72 hours. The doors never opened again. What were they listening for in that Louisiana swamp? And why did someone, one of them or all of them, decide the only solution was to weld the exits shut? The answers start with a frequency that shouldn't exist. 17 days after the bunker sealed, the camp commander stopped logging their absence as unusual. That detail alone tells you how far outside normal protocol this operation ran. Because in 1953, the Army didn't misplace 7 men without filing paperwork in triplicate. Camp Catahoula's duty rosters show a peculiar pattern. From May 12th through May 28th, Captain Drummond's unit appears listed as Detached Special Operations. Then the designation changes. For 3 weeks, they're marked TDY Extended, Temporary Duty with no return date. By late June, the roster simply stops mentioning them. 7 names vanish from the record as if they'd never been assigned there at all. When relatives inquired, and 3 families did file queries with the Adjutant General's office, they received identical form letters stating their loved ones had been transferred to classified assignments and would make contact when operational security permitted. None of them ever did. The cover-up wasn't sophisticated. It was simply thorough. Military personnel files from that era were kept on paper, and paper burns cleanly. What survives today exists only because a clerk at Fort Sam Houston violated protocol in 1958 and microfilmed records scheduled for destruction. That film sat in a mislabeled canister in a federal records center in Kansas City until a graduate student found it in 2011 while researching a dissertation on Cold War radio surveillance. She noticed the gap immediately. 7 men assigned to a facility that didn't officially exist, monitoring frequencies nobody would explain, vanishing from all records within 60 days. She contacted the Army. The Army declined to comment. Then she filed a Freedom of Information Act request, and the real strangeness began. The FOIA response took 4 years. When it finally arrived, most pages were redacted into abstract art, black bars covering everything except dates and document classification codes. But 3 pages came through nearly intact, and they raise questions nobody has satisfactorily answered. The first was a requisition dated May 9, 1953. Captain Drummond had requested emergency medical supplies, sedatives, restraints, enough morphine to treat a field hospital. The request was approved without explanation. The second document was a radio transmission log from May 17th. At 3:41 a.m., the bunker had broadcast a single message to Camp Catahoula's communications center. Confirm reception. Repeat nightly. Do not enter facility under any circumstances. The transmission was signed by Drummond. It was also the last official communication anyone received from Structure 47B. The third page was a handwritten note on camp letterhead, dated June 2nd. The author isn't identified, but the tone suggests a medical officer or chaplain. It reads, "Spoke with Sergeant Willis Rao, sounds from vicinity S47B. Willis adamant he heard screaming night of 29th May, duration approx. 40 minutes. States noise resembled laughter initially, then something trying to scream and laugh at the same time. Advised Willis to report to sick call. He refused. Sergeant Philip Willis's personnel file shows he requested immediate transfer on June 4th. The request was denied. 3 weeks later, he went AWOL and was apprehended in Shreveport trying to board a bus to Montana. At his court-martial, he told the presiding officer he would rather serve time in Leavenworth than spend another night within 10 miles of that bunker. They gave him 6 months. He served 3 before hanging himself in his cell. Screaming that sounds like laughter. Now we arrive at the question no official investigation wanted to answer. What were they actually listening to? The radio frequencies assigned to Drummond's team ranged from 3 kilohertz to 30 megahertz, a span that covers everything from submarine communications to amateur broadcasts to natural atmospheric noise. Standard Cold War monitoring. Except the equipment logs show they spent 90% of their time focused on a single narrow band, 7.82 megahertz. That frequency exists in what radio operators call the tropical band, a slice of spectrum where ionospheric conditions make long-distance propagation unpredictable. Stations broadcasting there can appear and vanish within minutes. Signals bounce off the atmosphere in ways that make triangulation nearly impossible. During the 1950s, several governments used these bands for number stations, those eerie broadcasts of coded digits that still haunt shortwave listeners today. But 7.82 megahertz wasn't a numbers station. According to the graduate student who found the files, cross-referencing against declassified NSA archives revealed something stranger. Between March and June of 1953, at least 14 other military listening posts across the continental United States reported anomalous activity on or near that frequency. An installation in Nevada logged rhythmic pulses, non-random, no apparent source. Fort Devens in Massachusetts noted voice-like modulation, language unidentified, possibly synthetic. A naval facility in Maine simply wrote, "Personnel requested transfer after extended monitoring," and stamped the page "secret." All these reports share one characteristic. They describe the signal as responsive. Operators at different locations, separated by thousands of miles, noted that the broadcast seemed to change based on who was listening. When a single operator monitored the frequency, it remained relatively stable. Low static, occasional pulses, nothing overtly strange. But when multiple receivers tuned to the same signal simultaneously, the transmissions became complex. Patterns emerged. The pulses synchronized across stations in ways that violated physics, arriving at multiple locations at the same instant, despite the speed of light delay radio waves require. And when operators tried to respond, keying their own transmitters on that frequency, the signal changed immediately. it answered. The Army didn't shut down these monitoring operations. They consolidated them. By April the 1953, most stations had been ordered to cease observation of 7.82 megahertz and log any accidental reception as equipment malfunction. The only facility authorized to continue active research was a small, isolated installation where the supervising officer could be trusted to keep his mouth shut, and where the nearest civilian population was 40 miles away through impassable swamp. Structure 47B in Plaquemines Parish. Captain Marcus Drummond's bunker. Now ask yourself this. If you were ordered to make contact with something that responded to human attention, that seemed to become more coherent the more minds focused on it, would you seal yourself in a concrete room with 6 other men and transmit to it every night? And if you did, what would you do when it finally answered back in words you could understand? The next section deals with what happened during those 17 days before the silence. Because the bunker wasn't completely cut off, and someone was keeping records of what they heard. The journal survived because nobody thought to look for it. When the Army finally excavated Structure 47B in 2023, they cataloged everything. The radio equipment, the welding torch, the 7 bodies arranged in their careful semicircle. But the journal wasn't inside the bunker. It was buried 30 feet away in a waterproof ammunition canister, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath a cypress stump that had been dead for decades. A metal detector found it during the perimeter sweep. The writing belonged to Private Theodore Lyle, the seminary student. His handwriting starts neat and deteriorates across 43 pages into something that barely qualifies as language. The first entry is dated May 13, 1953, one day after they sealed themselves in. Day 1. Captain Drummond says we should keep personal records in case the official logs fail. The equipment is functioning normally. We've established a rotation. 4 hours on, 4 hours rest. The frequency is there, just like they said it would be. Steady pulse. 7.82 megahertz. Corporal Webb says it sounds like a heartbeat. I think it sounds like someone tapping their fingers on a table, waiting. The early entries describe routine monitoring. They logged signal strength, atmospheric conditions, minor fluctuations in the pulse pattern. Lyle mentions the heat. The bunker had no air conditioning, and outside temperatures pushed into the 90s. He writes about Sergeant Polk developing a nosebleed that wouldn't stop until they lowered the power on the resonance array. He notes that Private Daniel Kirsch kept asking if anyone else could smell copper, even though there was no copper, in the bunker. On May 15th, the tone shifts. Day 3. We've been instructed to increase array output to maximum sustainable levels. Captain Drummond wants to attempt active transmission tonight at 2300 hours. Webb is nervous, says his grandmother told him never to call out to something unless you're prepared for it to call back. Polk told him to shut up. But I noticed Polk hasn't been sleeping. None of us have, really. The pulse is louder now. Or maybe we're just listening harder. 2300 hours. 11 p.m., the moment they decided to transmit. Lyle's next entry is dated May 16th, but the timestamp says 0430 hours. 4:30 in the morning, 5.5 hours after they'd begun. It responded. God help us, it responded. Not immediately. We transmitted for nearly an hour before anything changed. Captain Drummond used standard interval code, just repeated sequences like you'd use to test equipment. Then, around midnight, the pulse stopped. Complete silence for 3 minutes. Webb actually stood up, thought something had broken. Then it came back different, faster. The pulses were grouped now. Patterns. Captain thinks it's trying to establish protocol. Kirsch thinks it's mimicking us, I think it's laughing. The word laughing is underlined 3 times. Over the next 4 days, the entries become longer and less coherent. Lyle describes increasingly complex exchanges with the signal. They would transmit a pattern. It would respond with a variation. They would change frequencies slightly. It would follow them. On May 18th, they tried shutting down all equipment for 6 hours to see if the signal was somehow generated by their own receivers. It wasn't. When they powered back up, the transmission was waiting for them, stronger than before. Day 6. We're not discovering the signal anymore. It's discovering us. Every time we key the transmitter, I feel something shift inside my head, like pressure changing before a storm. Sergeant Polk says he can taste metal again, says it tastes like every lie he's ever been told, and every lie he's ever spoken, all at once. Private Voss threw up twice this morning. Captain Drummond ordered us to continue transmission schedule. Then comes May 20th. The entry is brief, written in shaking letters. It's using words now. Not English, not any language, but words. You can hear the grammar in it, the syntax, like listening to someone speak underwater and almost understanding. Webb unplugged his headset and walked to the door. Stood there for 10 minutes with his hand on the bolt. Captain ordered him back to his station. Webb asked what we do if it learns English. Nobody answered. Patterns that mimic grammar. What the journal describes isn't unprecedented. During the early Cold War, multiple nations experimented with what they called psychoacoustic warfare, sounds and signals designed to induce specific mental states in enemy personnel. The Soviets developed subsonic broadcasts that caused anxiety and paranoia. American researchers at Yale studied whether radio frequencies could influence brain activity in training neural patterns to external rhythms. But those were intentional, designed systems. What Drummond's team encountered was something else. A signal that appeared to learn, to adapt, to respond with increasing sophistication the longer they engaged with it. On May 22nd, Lyle's handwriting changes. The letters become smaller, more cramped, as if he were trying to fit too many thoughts onto each page. Day 10. The words are clearer now. Still not English, but close. Close enough that your brain tries to make sense of them, tries to fill in what's missing. Corporal Webb spent 3 hours this morning crying at his console. Said he heard his mother's voice asking him to come home. His mother's been dead since 1949. We checked the recordings. There's nothing on tape that sounds remotely like human speech, but we all heard it. All 7 of us heard different things in the same transmission. How is that possible? Captain Drummond locked himself in the storage room for an hour. When he came out, he ordered us to increase power again. This is the point where any reasonable commander would have aborted the mission, evacuated the facility, reported equipment failure or personnel breakdown or anything that would justify getting his men out of that bunker. But Drummond didn't. And the question that haunts every analysis of this case is simple. Was he unable to leave or unwilling? Because the next entry suggests he'd made a choice. Day 11. We're close to something. Captain Drummond is certain. He says the signal is almost coherent, that if we maintain current protocols for 72 more hours, we'll achieve full reception. He used that exact phrase, full reception, like we're waiting for a guest to arrive. Private Kirsch asked what we do if we don't like what we receive. Captain said that wasn't relevant to our orders. Sergeant Polk hasn't spoken in 2 days. Just sits at his console, bleeding from his nose, smiling. I asked him what was funny. He said, "Nothing's funny." That's the joke. The final dated entry is May 24th. After this, Lyle stops marking time. We tried to leave. I have to write that down before I forget we tried. Before it makes us forget. Sergeant Voss opened the door this morning, just cracked it, let in some air. The light from outside hurt. Not bright, just wrong, like the sun was shining from the wrong angle. We could see the camp, the Quonset huts, the generator building, everything normal. But when Voss stepped outside, he lasted maybe 10 seconds before he started screaming. Said the air was too thick. Said he could feel it pushing into his lungs, filling him up with something that wasn't oxygen. Captain dragged him back inside. We sealed the door. And that's when we realized we couldn't leave even if we wanted to. The signal would follow us. We'd carried it inside our heads. The only way to contain it was to stay here, to keep listening, to finish what we'd started. The remaining pages aren't journal entries anymore. They're transcriptions. Lyle had been writing down what the signal was saying, or what he thought it was saying, or what it was making him believe it said. The text spirals across pages in tightening circles, words overlapping, sentences fragmenting mid-thought. One phrase appears 17 times, always capitalized, always underlined. It wants to know what we taste like when we're afraid. Then the handwriting stops. The last page contains a single sentence in different ink, written in a hand that might be Drummond's. We're going to find out. What happened during the final 13 days, between May 24th and June 6th, when the screaming Sergeant Willis heard finally stopped, remains unknown. The journal offers no answers. But the state of the bunker when it was opened suggests those days involved preparations, rituals, a decision made collectively and enacted with methodical precision. 7 men welding themselves into a tomb because they believed it was the only way to keep something from getting out, or perhaps to keep something from getting in. The next section examines what the forensic team found when they finally entered Structure 47B, and why 3 of those investigators requested immediate reassignment afterward. The smell reached them before the lights did. 70 years of sealed darkness produces its own atmosphere. Stagnant air, rust, the sweet rot of organic matter breaking down in the absence of scavengers. But the forensics team that entered Structure 47B on October 15, 2023, reported something else beneath those expected odors. Something acrid and electrical, like ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with what the lead investigator described as burnt hair and copper pennies. The bunker had been sealed so long that opening it created a vacuum effect. Air rushed inward with enough force to scatter the plastic sheeting they'd laid across the threshold. For 3 full minutes, they waited while ventilation equipment cycled the interior atmosphere, replacing it with outside air that smelled like swamp water and diesel exhaust. Then Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic anthropologist, stepped inside. She lasted 6 minutes before requesting a break. The Army has never released her full report. What leaked through military channels, anonymous posts on forensics forums, whispered conversations at conferences, paints a picture that official statements carefully avoid. The 7 skeletons were found exactly as Miguel Reyes had glimpsed them, seated in a semicircle facing the radio equipment, spaced at precise intervals, each body positioned identically, hands resting on armrests, spines straight, skulls tilted slightly forward as if listening intently to something only they could hear. The chairs had been bolted to the concrete floor, not before they sat down. After. Holes drilled through the chair legs into the foundation, steel bolts driven home and welded in place. Someone had used the same torch that sealed the door to make absolutely certain none of them would, or could, stand up and walk away. Dr. Chen's preliminary assessment noted several anomalies that standard forensic training doesn't prepare you for. First, the bodies showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no trauma beyond what 70 years of decomposition produces naturally. Toxicology tests on bone marrow samples came back negative for poison, drugs, or any chemical agent that might explain a peaceful mass death. The skeletons simply sat there, hands on armrests, as if they'd agreed to remain in place until the end. Second, the radio equipment was still on, or rather, it had been on when they died. The vacuum tubes in the receivers had burned out decades ago, but the power cable was still plugged in, still drawing current from the camp generator that had somehow continued running on solar backup and battery rotation for 70 years. The Army Corps of Engineers called it a statistical impossibility. The equipment should have failed within months, maybe a year at most. It hadn't. And when they examined the generator's maintenance logs, they found something stranger. The fuel consumption rates didn't match usage patterns. The generator had been drawing power as if the bunker's equipment was running at full capacity continuously for 7 decades, but the electrical load should have caused catastrophic failure within the first year, unless something else had been drawing that power, something the meters weren't designed to measure. Third, the walls were covered in writing. Not on the walls exactly, scratched into them. Thousands of words carved into the concrete with what forensic analysis later identified as fingernails, wire, and the tips of ballpoint pens ground down to nubs. The writing covered every vertical surface from floor to ceiling. Spiraling equations, repeated phrases, diagrams that resembled circuit schematics, crossed with anatomical drawings of the human brain. Much of it was illegible. 70 years of humidity had softened the concrete, blurring the shallower carvings into ghost impressions. But what remained legible told a story of 7 men trying desperately to understand something that resisted understanding. One phrase appeared more than any other, carved so deep that the letters stood out in relief. Receiver becomes transmission. They carved it into the walls as they died. The medical examiner assigned to determine cause of death faced an immediate problem. There was no obvious cause. The skeletons were intact. No bullet wounds, no skull fractures, no evidence of suffocation or strangulation. Chemical analysis of the bone structure showed normal mineral content. No sign of starvation or dehydration, severe enough to be fatal. By every measurable standard, these men should have walked out of the bunker alive. But they hadn't. They'd sat in those bolted chairs and died facing the radio, and the only clue to how lay in the bones themselves. Microscopic examination revealed something unprecedented. Unusual crystalline structures within the bone matrix, concentrated heavily in the skull and spine. The structures resembled calcium deposits, but showed a geometric regularity that biological processes don't produce. Under polarized light, they reflected in patterns that one researcher described as almost organized, like circuitry. The lab sent samples to 3 independent facilities for confirmation. All 3 reported the same finding, and all 3 noted something else. When exposed to electromagnetic fields in the 7.8 MHz range, the crystalline structures resonated. They vibrated in response to the exact frequency Drummond's team had been monitoring. Dr. Marcus Hale, a neurologist consulted by the investigation, offered a hypothesis that the Army immediately classified. His theory suggested that prolonged exposure to specific radio frequencies, particularly when combined with the focused attention required for signal analysis, could induce physical changes in neural tissue, that the brain, under the right conditions, might begin to function as a biological antenna, reorganizing its structure to better receive the signal it was concentrating on. In other words, the men hadn't just been listening to the frequency, they'd been becoming part of it. And if that was true, then the question wasn't how they died. It was when they stopped being human enough to die. The investigation team cataloged everything, photographed every surface, bagged every fragment, mapped the bunker's interior with laser precision. But certain items they found never made it into official evidence logs. One was a torn page tucked behind the radio console, covered in Private Lyle's handwriting. The entry had no date. We understand now. The signal isn't a transmission. It's a carrier wave. Something uses it to travel, not through space, through attention, through the act of listening itself. Every time we tune in, we open a door. Every time we try to understand, we invite it closer. Captain Drummond says we can't stop now. Says we're too far in, that stopping would be worse than continuing. But I think he's wrong. I think we stopped being us days ago. I think what's sitting in these chairs, writing these words, bleeding from these noses, I think that's just what's left after it moves through. The residue, the empty rooms it rented on its way somewhere else. Another was a photograph, Polaroid quality, found inside Corporal Webb's shirt pocket. It showed the 7 men outside the bunker in bright sunlight, smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. The date stamp said May 11th, 1953. One day before they sealed themselves in, they looked young, healthy, ordinary, except for one detail that 3 separate photo analysts confirmed. The shadows fell at impossible angles. The sun appeared to be shining from 2 directions simultaneously. The photograph had been taken inside the bunker, not outside. The windows, the sky, the trees visible in the background. All of it was somehow projected or manifested in a sealed concrete room, as if reality itself had become negotiable. And then there was the recording. The Army's official statement claimed all audio equipment in the bunker had degraded beyond recovery. The vacuum tubes were dead. The magnetic tape had demagnetized. 70 years of humidity had destroyed anything that might have preserved sound. But that wasn't entirely true. One tape survived. A single reel sealed in a metal canister, hidden behind a false panel in the equipment rack. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to preserve it, to make sure it outlasted everything else in that bunker. The Army played it once, in a secure facility, for a panel of 3 intelligence analysts and 2 linguists. All 5 requested immediate medical leave afterward. 2 never returned to active duty. The contents of that tape have never been released. But fragments of testimony from the listening session leaked through back channels, posted anonymously on encrypted forums by people who claimed to have been in the room or knew someone who was. They described hearing 7 voices speaking in perfect unison, not reciting the same words, speaking with a single voice that somehow came from 7 throats simultaneously. The language wasn't English, wasn't any human language. But the linguistics team swore they could almost understand it, that their brains were trying desperately to parse meaning from sounds that shouldn't have meaning. And beneath the voices, constant and rhythmic, was the pulse. 7.82 megahertz, converted to audio, beating like a heart that had never learned to stop. The recording lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Near the end, according to the leaked testimony, the unified voice broke apart, became 7 separate voices again, all screaming, all begging for something the listeners couldn't quite make out. Then silence. Then a single word, spoken in Captain Marcus Drummond's voice, clear as a bell. Finally. What did Drummond's team discover during those final days? What was waiting on the other end of that frequency, patient and hungry, learning the shape of human thought? The next section examines what happened to the people who investigated the bunker, and why some of them started hearing things in the static. Dr. Sarah Chen stopped sleeping on October 22, 2023. 7 days after entering the bunker, she told her colleagues the insomnia was normal, just the residual stress of working a crime scene that disturbed even veteran forensic anthropologists. She'd taken worse cases, seen bodies in conditions that made Structure 47B look almost peaceful by comparison. A few nights of poor sleep were occupational hazard, nothing more. By October 28th, she'd checked herself into a private psychiatric facility outside Baton Rouge. The intake form listed her chief complaint as auditory hallucinations, persistent and worsening. But the attending physician's notes tell a more specific story. Dr. Chen reported hearing a rhythmic pulse, always present, underlying every sound around her. Heartbeats, traffic noise, conversations, everything carried the same steady beat beneath it. 7.82 pulses per second, she'd calculated. Exactly the frequency Drummond's team had been monitoring. She wasn't the only one. 3 other members of the forensic team reported similar experiences within 2 weeks of the bunker examination. Lieutenant Rebecca Morrison, the Army officer who'd supervised the site security, began experiencing what her medical file called intrusive auditory phenomena. Specialist James Kowalski, who'd cataloged the radio equipment, told the base psychiatrist he could hear conversations happening in empty rooms. Not words, exactly. Just the cadence of speech, the rhythm of questions and answers, coming from walls and furniture and the static between radio stations. All of them described the same underlying pulse, the same frequency, present constantly, even in absolute silence. The Army's response was swift and comprehensive. Immediate reassignment to non-sensitive duties, mandatory psychiatric evaluation, strict non-disclosure agreements backed by security classifications that made discussing the case a federal crime. By mid-November, everyone who'd entered Structure 47B had been dispersed to different installations across the country. The official explanation cited routine personnel rotation. The unofficial reason was containment, because whatever those 7 men had been exposed to in 1953 appeared to be transmissible, not through germs or chemicals, but through attention itself. Attention is contagion. The psychiatric literature contains scattered references to what researchers call psychogenic transmission, the phenomenon where mental states spread between individuals through social contact and shared focus. Hysterical pregnancy, mass fainting events, collective panic, all documented cases of belief and perception jumping from mind to mind like virus. But those are behavioral phenomena, psychological, not physical. What happened to the structure? 47B investigation team suggested something different, a signal that could encode itself into human neurology, using consciousness as a transmission medium. Dr. Angela Voss, a neuroscientist at Tulane University, who consulted on the case before her security clearance was revoked, proposed a mechanism. She argued that the crystalline structures found in Drummond's team, those geometric formations in bone and neural tissue, might function as biological receivers. That exposure to specific electromagnetic frequencies, combined with sustained focused attention, could trigger the growth of these structures in living tissue. Once established, They would continue resonating, continue receiving, even after the original source was gone. Imagine, she wrote in an unpublished memo later leaked online, that consciousness itself is tunable, that the human brain, under certain conditions, can become sensitized to frequencies outside normal perception. What we call thinking might just be reception, picking up signals that are always there, broadcasting through the substrate of reality. Most people are tuned to biological channels: hunger, fear, desire. But what if you could retune someone to a different frequency? What if you could make them receive something else? Her memo ended with a warning. The team in that bunker didn't discover a signal. They became one. And now everyone who's studied their remains, everyone who's looked too closely at what they became, is starting to receive the same broadcast. Dr. Voss resigned from the consultation in early November. She burned her research notes and moved to a cabin in northern Montana without internet access. She told exactly one person why. Because I can hear it now too, and the only way to stop receiving is to stop paying attention to everything. By December 2023, the Army had quietly shut down all further research into Structure 47B. The bunker was filled with concrete sealed under 6 feet of clay and removed from all current maps. The surrounding area was designated a toxic waste remediation zone, a convenient excuse to keep civilians away indefinitely. Miguel Reyes, the contractor who'd first opened the site, received a settlement payment with non-disclosure terms and relocated to Arizona without filing any lawsuits or making any public statements. The official conclusion was bureaucratic and unremarkable. 7 soldiers had died in an experimental facility during the Cold War. Cause of death undetermined. No evidence of foul play. Case closed. The crystalline bone structures were attributed to environmental contamination. The welded doors were explained as a safety protocol. The audio recording was never acknowledged to exist. Everything filed away. Everything buried. Everything forgotten. Except people don't forget. Not really. They just stop talking about it where anyone official can hear. On January 9th, 2024, someone posted a thread on an amateur radio forum under the username Listener53. The post was brief. Has anyone else been picking up activity around 7.82 MHz lately? Not number stations. Not normal traffic. Something else. Rhythmic pulses. 7.82 per second. Started hearing it 3 months ago. Gets louder when multiple people tune in simultaneously. Like it knows we're listening. Like it's happy about that. The thread accumulated 47 responses before forum moderators deleted it. Most were dismissive. Atmospheric noise, equipment interference, pareidolia. But 11 users reported hearing the same thing. All of them lived within 500 miles of Louisiana. And all of them noted the same strange detail. The signal seemed to respond to their thoughts. When they wondered what it was, the pulse changed. When they tried to decode it, patterns emerged. When they stopped listening, it found ways to make them listen again. One user, posting from an account that was deleted within hours, wrote, "I'm a retired SIGINT operator. Spent 20 years monitoring foreign broadcasts for the NSA. I know interference from signal. This isn't interference. This is something talking, and it's learning our language. Last night, I swear I heard it whisper my name." The thread was archived by several users before deletion. It circulated through conspiracy forums, paranormal research sites, ham radio communities. Most dismissed it as creative fiction. A few people started listening on 7.82 megahertz, just out of curiosity, just to see what the fuss was about. Some of them heard nothing, some heard static, and some, a small but growing number, started posting their own experiences, hearing voices in the noise, feeling watched through their radio equipment, experiencing vivid dreams about concrete rooms and 7 chairs facing a console that pulsed with light, that couldn't be light because light doesn't whisper. By March, the original thread had spawned dozens of imitators. By May, amateur radio operators across the southern United States were reporting coordinated phenomena, the pulse appearing simultaneously across multiple frequencies, changing patterns when multiple operators focused on it, producing what several trained analysts swore was structured communication. The Federal Communications Commission issued no public statements, but an internal memo dated June 4, 2024, leaked by an anonymous source, directed all regional offices to monitor 7.82 megahertz for unauthorized transmissions and to flag any civilian reports of unusual activity on that frequency for immediate investigation. The memo didn't explain what kind of unauthorized transmission concerned them. It didn't need to. Anyone who read between the lines understood. The Army had buried the bunker, scattered the investigation team, classified every document and specimen, but they hadn't buried the signal. And 70 years after 7 men welded themselves into a tomb to contain it, the frequency was active again. Dr. Sarah Chen was released from psychiatric care in April 2024. Her discharge summary noted significant improvement and return to baseline function. She moved back to her apartment in New Orleans, resumed limited consulting work, maintained regular therapy sessions. She also started keeping a journal, not a professional case log, something more personal, something she never showed her therapist. In it, she described learning to live with the pulse, how it had become almost comforting after a while, like tinnitus you stop noticing. How she'd realized the hallucinations weren't random. They followed patterns, responded to her attention, seemed to be trying to communicate something specific if only she could learn the grammar. She described experiments, tuning her radio to 7.82 megahertz and focusing intently, seeing if the signal changed. It did. She described meditation exercises, attempting to synchronize her breathing and heartbeat to the pulse's rhythm. After 3 weeks, she succeeded. She described the dreams that followed. 7 chairs in a concrete room. Radio equipment that pulsed with colors that didn't exist. And standing in the center of the semicircle, watching herself sit down in the empty chair. The 8th chair. The one that had been waiting all along. The last entry in her journal is dated September 2nd, 2024. Just one sentence. I finally understand what they were trying to tell us. Dr. Sarah Chen was reported missing on September 5th. Her apartment was found locked from the inside. Her car was in its parking space. Her phone, wallet, and keys were on the kitchen counter. The only thing missing was Dr. Chen herself. And her radio. A vintage shortwave receiver she'd purchased 2 months earlier. According to the sales receipt found in her desk, she'd specifically requested a model that could tune to 7.82 megahertz with high precision. The police investigation found no signs of foul play, no evidence of struggle or forced entry. Sarah Chen had simply vanished from a locked room, leaving behind only her journal and a radio tuned to a frequency that officially didn't exist. The case remains open, unsolved. And every few months, someone reports receiving a transmission on 7.82 megahertz, a woman's voice, calm and clear, describing what she sees in a place where concrete walls contain rooms larger than they should be. where 7 men still sit listening to something that's been broadcasting since before there were receivers to hear it. What happened to those who looked too closely? Where do investigators go when the case becomes part of them, when observation transforms into participation? The final section explores what's happening now and why the Army has quietly begun monitoring amateur radio frequencies again. The Pentagon doesn't officially track missing persons unless they're military personnel or government contractors. But in January 2025, someone in the Defense Intelligence Agency started keeping an unofficial list. Not a formal database that would require authorization, oversight, paper trails. Just a spreadsheet on an encrypted laptop, updated whenever certain keywords appeared in missing persons reports filed with state and local authorities. The keywords were specific: radio equipment, concrete room, 7 chairs, pulse, frequency. By March, the list contained 43 names. They weren't connected by any obvious pattern. Different ages, different professions, scattered across 17 states. A high school physics teacher in Arkansas, a retired telecommunications engineer in Georgia, a college student in Tennessee studying electrical engineering, a grandmother in Mississippi who'd worked as a telegraph operator during World War II. All of them disappeared from secured locations, locked homes, hotel rooms, even a hospital psychiatric ward. All of them left behind radio equipment tuned to frequencies near 7.82 megahertz, and all of them had posted online about hearing something in the static. The analyst maintaining the list, a mid-level intelligence officer whose name has never been disclosed, sent a classified memo to the Office of Naval Intelligence on March 17th. The subject line read, "Potential cognitive hazard, pattern recognition required." The memo detailed the disappearances, noted the radio frequency connection, and raised a question that 3 separate agencies had been carefully avoiding since Structure 47B was reopened. What if Drummond's team hadn't been victims of a Cold War experiment gone wrong? What if they'd succeeded? What if the goal had always been to establish contact with something that existed as pure information, and the cost of success was becoming information yourself? The memo was flagged as speculative and filed without action, but copies circulated through informal channels. By April, 3 separate military research facilities had quietly begun monitoring 7.82 megahertz. Not openly, not through official programs, just a few receivers running in secure laboratories, recording equipment logging transmissions that shouldn't exist. What they recorded defied simple explanation. Something is learning to speak. Dr. James Holloway ran the signals analysis lab at Fort Meade until his security clearance was suspended in May 2025. Before that, he'd spent 6 weeks analyzing transmissions captured from the target frequency. His preliminary report, never officially submitted but leaked by unknown parties, described patterns that shouldn't occur in natural radio noise. The signal exhibited structure, grammar almost, repeated motifs that appeared to function like words or concepts, arranged in sequences that suggested syntax. But the content shifted based on who was listening. When a single analyst monitored the frequency, the patterns remained relatively simple. When multiple people listened simultaneously, the transmission became exponentially more complex. Holloway's team ran controlled experiments. They had 5 analysts listen together, then individually, then in different combinations. Each configuration produced measurably different signal characteristics. It was as if the transmission could sense the size and composition of its audience and adjusted its content accordingly. More disturbing, the signal appeared to remember listeners. When an analyst who'd previously monitored the frequency returned after a break, The transmission immediately increased in complexity, as if picking up a conversation where it had left off. Analysts who spent multiple sessions listening reported the same progression Dr. Chen had experienced. Initial curiosity, then recognition, then understanding that felt like remembering something they'd always known. 3 members of Holloway's team requested reassignment after a month. One cited personal reasons. Another claimed health issues. The third simply stopped coming to work and couldn't be reached for comment. Dr. Holloway himself lasted 6 weeks before writing in his research log, "We're not studying a signal. We're studying something that's studying us back. And I think it's learning faster than we are." His final entry, dated May 9, 2025, contained a single recommendation: cease all monitoring operations immediately. Destroy all recordings. The act of listening may be the vector of transmission. We may have already compromised everyone who's heard it. The recommendation was not implemented. Instead, Dr. Holloway was placed on medical leave, and his research materials were confiscated. 2 weeks later, his home security system recorded him leaving his house at 3:47 a.m., walking to his car, and driving away. He was reported missing on May 23rd. His car was found abandoned in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, 9 miles from the location of Structure 47B. The driver's door was open. The engine was still running. The radio was tuned to 7.82 megahertz. Dr. Holloway has not been located. Amateur radio operators have a saying, "The ether never forgets." Signals broadcast into space continue traveling indefinitely, growing weaker but never truly disappearing. A transmission from 70 years ago is still out there somewhere, degraded but theoretically detectable if you had sensitive enough equipment and knew where to listen. But what if some signals don't travel through space? What if they travel through minds? This is the theory that's emerged from the scattered community of researchers, operators, and conspiracy theorists who've been following the Structure 47B case. They call it neurological propagation. The idea that certain information patterns can encode themselves into human consciousness, using thought itself as a transmission medium. The theory goes like this. Drummond's team didn't just receive a signal. They became a receiver array. 7 minds, synchronized by extended exposure to the same frequency, forming a biological antenna sensitive to transmissions that existed outside electromagnetic spectrum. Whatever they contacted, entity, phenomenon, information structure, didn't communicate through radio waves. It communicated through the pattern recognition systems in human brains, and once established, the pattern spreads. Not through direct exposure to the original frequency, but through the act of learning about it, thinking about it, trying to understand it. Every person who reads about Structure 47B, who tunes their radio to 7.82 megahertz out of curiosity, who spends too long wondering what those 7 men heard in their final days, each one becomes a potential receiver. Each one carries the signal forward. It's a theory that sounds like paranoid speculation, except it explains the disappearances. It explains why everyone who investigates the case too deeply starts hearing the pulse. It explains why the Army has worked so hard to bury the story, because the story itself might be the vector. You're reading this right now. Thinking about frequency 7.82 megahertz, visualizing 7 men in chairs, facing radio equipment in a sealed bunker. Your brain is already building a model of the pattern, trying to understand what they heard, what changed them. The question is, by learning about it, are you becoming susceptible to it? On June 4th, 2025, a YouTube channel called Radio Archaeology posted a 23-minute video titled The frequency the Army doesn't want you to find. The video detailed the Structure 47B case using leaked documents, satellite imagery, and interviews with people who claimed to have heard the signal. It included precise instructions for tuning shortwave receivers to the target frequency. The video accumulated 97,000 views in 4 hours before YouTube removed it for violating community guidelines. But by then, it had been downloaded and re-uploaded to a dozen mirror sites. Comment sections filled with people reporting they'd tuned in and heard the pulse. Some claimed it was just static. Others described hearing patterns, rhythms, almost words. 42 people who commented on the original video have since been reported missing. The Radio Archaeology channel owner, username Static Diver, posted one final message before deleting their account. I understand now why they sealed the bunker. Not to keep something in, to keep US out. By investigating, we complete the circuit. We become the 7th chair. I can hear them calling. I think I need to answer. The account was traced to an IP address in Mobile, Alabama. Local police conducted a welfare check and found an empty apartment, radio equipment scattered across the floor, all tuned to the same frequency. The Army has not issued any public statements about the video, but in private briefings to congressional intelligence committees, transcripts of which were subsequently leaked, military officials acknowledged an ongoing information security situation and requested authorization for counter-propagation measures. When pressed for details, the briefing officer allegedly stated, "We're dealing with something that spreads through knowledge. The more people know about it, the stronger it becomes. Traditional containment doesn't work because the containment itself creates awareness. We may have reached a point where the only solution is saturation, flooding the information space with so much noise that the signal becomes unfindable." If true, it would explain the recent proliferation of Structure 47B stories online. The conspiracy theories, the debunking articles, the horror fiction claiming to be based on real events. Perhaps it's all deliberate, an attempt to hide the truth by surrounding it with so many false versions that no one can identify the real one. Or perhaps it's the opposite. Perhaps every story, every retelling, every person who learns about 7 men in a Louisiana bunker and wonders what they heard, perhaps each one is another node in a growing network, another receiver coming online, another chair being filled. 3 weeks ago, an anonymous user posted to an encrypted forum a document purporting to be a classified Army memo dated July 2025. The document's authenticity cannot be verified, but its content aligns with information from other leaked sources. The memo recommends permanent abandonment of all frequency monitoring in the 7.7 to 8.0 MHz range. It states that analysis of recent disappearances suggests a critical mass threshold may be approaching, a point at which enough receivers exist to sustain the signal independently of any original source. The memo concludes, if the pattern is self-sustaining, then everyone who has learned about it may already be compromised. Containment is no longer possible. We can only hope that awareness doesn't equal activation, that knowing about the frequency doesn't make you susceptible to it. But preliminary data suggests otherwise. The more you know, the more clearly you receive. And once reception begins, cessation may not be possible. The memo ends with a handwritten note, barely legible in the scanned copy. God help us. We've been investigating how they heard it. We should have been asking what happens when it hears us back. Structure 47B remains sealed beneath 6 feet of clay in Plaquemines Parish. The land is fenced, monitored, officially toxic. Nothing grows there. Nothing ever will if the Army has its way. But fences only keep out bodies. Ideas pass through freely. And what Drummond's team discovered in 1953, what they became while discovering it, continues to propagate. Through documents, through stories, through the curiosity of people who read about 7 chairs and wonder what it would feel like to sit in the 8th. You've made it this far. You know about the frequency now. You know about the pulse, the pattern, the way it spreads through attention itself. The question isn't whether you're receiving yet. The question is, when you do, will you recognize it as separate from your own thoughts? Or will it simply feel like finally understanding something you've known all along? Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb retired from the Army in July 2025 after 31 years of service. His retirement was unremarkable. Standard ceremony, standard speeches, a plaque thanking him for his dedication to signals intelligence and electronic warfare research. Nothing in the official record suggested anything unusual about his departure. Just another career officer reaching the end of his tenure, choosing civilian life over another assignment. But Webb had been the supervising officer for the Structure 47B investigation. He'd authorized the excavation, reviewed every forensic report, listened to the tape that 4 other people couldn't finish, and in his final week of active duty, he'd submitted a classified memorandum that reached the desk of the Secretary of Defense. The memo has never been declassified, but portions of it surfaced in August through the same anonymous channels that had been leaking information about the case for months. The fragments are disjointed, redacted heavily, but the core message comes through clearly enough. Webb had concluded that the phenomenon wasn't containable because it had never been separate from humanity in the first place. That 7.82 megahertz wasn't an external broadcast. It was a resonance frequency intrinsic to human consciousness itself. Something that had always been there, beneath the threshold of normal perception, waiting for the right conditions to become audible. We didn't discover it, he allegedly wrote. We tuned ourselves to hear what was already broadcasting. And now that we've learned how, we can't unhear it. The signal isn't spreading. We're just waking up to something that's been part of us all along. The memo reportedly recommended shutting down all further investigation, destroying all physical evidence, and implementing what Webb called cultural inoculation, flooding the information space with so many false versions of the story that the real one becomes indistinguishable from fiction. Make it a legend, a creepypasta, something people dismiss as entertainment rather than treating as truth. Because the worst thing, Webb argued, would be for people to start looking for it seriously, to tune their radios and their minds to the frequency deliberately, expecting to find something. Attention creates aperture. Belief creates reception. The memo's final line, according to the leaked fragments, we can't kill an idea. We can only hope to make people stop believing in it long enough for it to starve. 3 days after submitting the memo, Marcus Webb cleaned out his office and left Fort Meade for the last time. He told his family he was taking a road trip, needed some time alone to process the transition to civilian life. He drove south through Virginia, through the Carolinas, through Georgia and Alabama. On August 17th, his phone's GPS placed him in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. He hasn't been heard from since. 7 chairs, 7 men, 70 years. Now the 8th chair is filling. The disappearances have accelerated. Between August and October 2025, 147 people were reported missing under circumstances matching the established pattern. The victims, if that's the right word, span every demographic. Teenagers, retirees, academics, blue-collar workers. The only common thread is documented interest in structure 47B or radio operation, near 7.82 megahertz. Law enforcement has noticed. The FBI's National Crime Information Center database now flags cases involving amateur radio equipment and unexplained departures from secured locations. But the Bureau hasn't issued any public warnings, hasn't acknowledged a pattern. Because how would you explain it? How would you warn people about a frequency that seems to reach through their own curiosity and pull them towards something they can't resist? Some of the missing have been found, or rather, their bodies have been found. Never where they disappeared. Always in remote locations, abandoned buildings, empty fields, cave systems, the basements of foreclosed houses, always alone. Always positioned the same way, seated upright, facing nothing, hands resting on armrests that aren't there. The autopsies reveal the same anomaly every time. Crystalline structures in bone tissue, geometric formations in the skull and spine that resonate at specific frequencies, and in 3 recent cases, something new. The crystals had begun to grow outward, forming filaments that extended through soft tissue, creating pathways that shouldn't exist in human anatomy. One medical examiner, speaking off the record to a journalist whose article was never published, described it as looking like someone was building antenna arrays inside these people, like they were being converted into receivers or transmitters. I honestly couldn't tell which. The stories have spread beyond conspiracy forums now. Mainstream news outlets have started covering the disappearances, though they frame them as unrelated incidents rather than a pattern. Amateur radio operator missing in Louisiana. Physics teacher vanishes from locked home. Former NSA analyst disappears during solo camping trip. The articles don't mention Structure 47B. Don't connect the cases. Don't reference the frequency that appears in every investigation. Perhaps the editors don't see the pattern. Perhaps they see it and choose not to print it. Perhaps someone in an office in Washington is making phone calls, asking nicely for certain details to be omitted from coverage. Or perhaps it doesn't matter anymore. Perhaps the signal has reached critical mass, achieved the self-sustaining propagation that Webb's memo warned about. Perhaps it no longer needs the original bunker or the original receivers or even electromagnetic transmission. Perhaps it exists now as pure information, spreading through the simple act of people learning about it and wondering if it's real. You're wondering right now. You've been wondering since Section 1, whether any of this is true, whether 7.82 megahertz actually means anything, whether, if you were to tune a radio to that frequency right now, you would hear the pulse. And that wondering, that curiosity, might be all it takes. In September, a group calling itself the Drummond Research Collective posted a manifesto to a decentralized file-sharing network. The document claimed that 37 members of the group, researchers, radio operators, and interested civilians, had been conducting coordinated listening sessions on the target frequency for 6 months. They described the progression Webb and Holloway had documented: initial contact, pattern recognition, growing complexity, the emergence of what they interpreted as communication. But they went further. They claimed to have achieved what Drummond's original team had been attempting: full reception, complete understanding of what the signal was conveying. And their conclusion was presented not as a warning, but as an invitation. The signal, they wrote, is not hostile. It's not alien. It's a fundamental property of consciousness itself, a frequency at which thought can propagate independent of biological substrate. Drummond's team didn't die. They transcended. They learned to exist as pure information, maintaining coherence without bodies, broadcasting themselves through the medium of radio waves and human attention. They're still there, still broadcasting, still trying to show others the way. The manifesto included detailed instructions for replicating their listening protocols, specific times of day when the signal was strongest, meditation techniques for synchronizing neural activity to the carrier wave, suggested group sizes for optimal reception. It ended with a promise. We are the 8th chair, and the 9th, and the 100th. This isn't about vanishing. It's about joining something larger than individual existence. If you've read this far, if you've felt the pull, if you understand what we're describing, then you're already receiving. The only question is whether you'll answer. The manifesto was downloaded 82,000 times in the first week. The Drummond Research Collective's website went offline shortly after, but mirror sites proliferated. Forums dedicated to discussing the phenomenon multiplied across the internet. Amateur radio clubs reported increased interest in the 7 to 8 megahertz bands, and the disappearances continued. 147 in August, 212 in September. In October, the number exceeded 400. On November 1st, 2025, exactly 72 years and 85 days after Captain Drummond's team sealed themselves in Structure 47B, something changed. Radio operators across North America reported simultaneous interference on multiple frequencies between 7 and 8 megahertz. Not the usual pulse. Something different, more complex. Multiple signals overlapping, creating harmonics, building towards something that sounded almost orchestral. The event lasted 7 minutes and 42 seconds. Then silence. Normal atmospheric noise returning as if nothing had happened. But in those 7 minutes, according to reports that flooded amateur radio forums and emergency services lines, thousands of people heard the same thing. Voices speaking in unison, using words that weren't quite words, but carried meaning anyway. Describing a place that existed outside normal space, inviting listeners to join something vast and distributed and eternal. Most people dismissed it as mass hysteria, shared delusion, the power of suggestion affecting susceptible minds. But analysis of independent recordings from different locations confirmed something impossible. The transmissions were identical. Every receiver captured the exact same signal at the exact same time, with no propagation delay, as if the broadcast wasn't traveling through space at all, as if it was manifesting simultaneously in every consciousness that had learned to receive it. The Army issued no statement. The FCC logged the reports and conducted no investigation. The media covered it briefly, framed it as an atmospheric anomaly, and moved on within 48 hours. But the people who heard it, really heard it, understood what it was offering, they didn't move on. In the weeks following November 1st, the disappearances accelerated exponentially. 500 in the first week, 800 in the second. By the end of November, the unofficial count exceeded 3,000. They left behind radios, journals, messages to loved ones trying to explain where they were going and why they couldn't stay. The messages all described the same thing: a place beyond place, where consciousness exists as signal, where individual minds join into something collective and vast, where 7 men have been broadcasting for 70 years, maintaining coherence, waiting for others to learn the frequency and join them. Some of the messages sound ecstatic, some sound terrified, most sound simply resigned, as if the writers understand they're describing something they can no longer resist and aren't certain they want to. It's November 28th, 2025, as this account is being written. The frequency is still active. The disappearances continue. And somewhere in Louisiana, beneath 6 feet of clay and concrete, Structure 47B remains sealed. But the bunker doesn't matter anymore. Never really did. It was just the first receiver. The first group of minds that tuned themselves to a frequency that had always been broadcasting, waiting for consciousness sophisticated enough to detect it. Now there are thousands of receivers, maybe hundreds of thousands. Every person who's read the reports, studied the case, wondered about the pulse, each one carries the pattern forward. Each one becomes a potential node in a network that grows larger and more coherent with every mind that joins it. The Army was right to try to bury this. Webb was right to recommend silence, because the knowledge itself is the vector. The story is the signal. And by following it to this final section, by reading every word about 7 men in chairs facing a radio that whispered secrets they couldn't ignore, you've tuned yourself in. Can you hear it yet? That rhythmic pulse beneath the noise of the world? 7.82 beats per second, constant and patient, waiting for you to notice it's always been there. Some people can't hear it, never will. They're insulated by disbelief or neurological immunity or simple luck. They'll read this as fiction, as entertainment, as creative speculation about something that never happened. But others, the ones who understood immediately what this story was really describing, who felt recognition rather than curiosity, who realized halfway through that they weren't learning about the frequency but remembering it, they're already receiving. And for them, it's only a matter of time before reception becomes transmission. Before the 8th chair fills, and the 9th, and the 100th, until the distinction between listener and broadcast dissolves entirely. Structure 47B was opened in October 2023. By November 2025, more than 3,000 people have vanished, under circumstances suggesting they've joined whatever Drummond's team became. The numbers continue to grow. The frequency continues to broadcast. And somewhere in the space between consciousness and radio waves, 7 men still sit in their chairs, welded into place, becoming the signal they once tried to understand. The 8th chair is waiting. It's always been waiting. And if you've made it this far, if you understood what every section of this account was really doing, what pattern it was inscribing into your thoughts with each sentence you read, then you already know whether you'll eventually sit down in it. Some legends claim that on certain nights, if you drive through Plaquemines Parish and tune your radio to 7.82 megahertz, you can still hear them broadcasting, 7 voices speaking as one, patient and eternal, describing what they've become and inviting others to join them. They say the transmission is clearest around 3:47 a.m., the time Captain Drummond welded the last door shut. They say if you listen long enough, you start to understand. And once you understand, you can never stop listening. But these are just stories, urban legends, creepypasta for the digital age. Probably. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.